Hello, everyone. Welcome
Oh,
to RecAd Savvy. Are we on, Michael? Stephen? There we are. Okay. Sorry about that. Welcome again to RecAd Savvy, our webcast about all things related to online recruitment, advertising, and marketing. And today we have a special show. Pay has always been an important aspect of effective talent acquisition, but probably more so today than ever before. We've been talking more recently about pay transparency, but according to an ADP survey, 70% of job seekers say that pay plays an important role in their considering a prospective employer. So clearly, it's something that has an impact on our ability to successfully recruit online. And there's no better person to help us sort through the issues than Sarah White, the founder and CEO of research company Aspect 43. They've recently done a report called Pay Equity, the New Baseline at Work. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I always love being here.
Great, terrific. So I always like to begin, since there's lots of new people coming into our industry all the time, I'd always like to begin with asking our guests to introduce themselves and their company. So tell us a little bit about Sarah White and Aspect 43.
Absolutely. So Aspect 43 is a research and strategy firm focused on the HR and TAtech markets. And so we spend a lot of our time actually conducting surveys, doing research, and then writing about the technology and what we are finding and how that technology is intersecting with work. And so we care a little bit less about like how are people using the technology and more about making sure they even understand the technology is there and available, which is what we find the biggest gap to be. The other side of our business works with investment firms and with the technology vendors themselves to make sure that we are bringing the voice of the practitioner and the end user, as well as the employee, directly into the technology. And we are transforming product roadmaps. We are changing how these technologies actually market, sell, and engage with their customers and their prospects through the entire process, so everyone stops getting their time wasted.
Well, that's important these days, especially these days.
So and all our research is free. So you can go to our website and always find all of our research at any given time. You're not going to get a bunch of emails. You don't get signed up for anything. You could just get access to everything.
And what's that URL, just so people know for sure?
Aspect43.com.
There you go. Okay. So you're the founder of Aspect 43. How did you come to do that? What's your background?
Yeah, so I actually fell into talent acquisition and recruiting software when I was a freshman in college. And I had
just a couple of years ago.
Like 3-ish years ago or more. I had no intention of staying. Like I was headed to LA to become an actress. Like that was my path. I was never going to go into tech at all. And I just absolutely fell in love with the reality that we can use technology and use these tools to actually change people's lives. We can get them jobs faster. We can better understand what their needs are. We can match them. We can, there was just so many amazing things that we were able to do with the technology. And so I led TAtech teams or TA internal in-house teams early in my career. Left that, went and actually started a company in my early 20s focused on buying TA technology and implementing TA technology. We were acquired shortly thereafter. I went from there, became chief strategy officer of a tech vendor in the space, which is now Clear Company. And from there was recruited by Josh Bursman to come in and help start the TA practice for Josh and set up the analyst and the consulting practice on the TA side there, and then have been doing kind of consulting and freelance for a number of years before starting my own firm in late 2020. And so we've worked with, I think we've researched or surveyed over 150,000 companies globally. about their challenges with hiring, with retaining talent, as well as employees in that process. And we've worked to help improve product roadmaps and processes for more than 300 vendors in the space globally.
So, shameless plug, everyone. Sarah is on the faculty and will be speaking at TAtech North America and the World Job Board Forum coming up in Austin on May 22 to 24. She is going to be an important part of our new Investors and Analysts Summit at that event. Plus, she's also going to preview some of her research in a separate presentation. So,
come have breakfast with me.
What's that?
We'll have breakfast together, right?
Yes, we will.
I think it's breakfast and stats. So we'll have some conversations, open Q&A, and we're just going to talk about some of the information that we find.
Cool. So let's talk about pay equity.
Yes.
As I mentioned earlier, your firm recently did a white paper on that topic, and just to make sure that we're all beginning from the same spot, what exactly is pay equity?
So pay equity is really ensuring people are compensated fairly for doing the same job. And a lot of times we think about pay equity in terms of gender. Are men and women getting paid the same? And that's a really, a stat that you see all over, and like, oh, it's, 83 cents for, so it's a very marketing driven conversation. But at its core, in a business, a lot of times pay equity isn't necessarily as much of a gender issue as it can be a tenure issue, or quite honestly, tenure is a major factor, but it can be age issue. Somebody that is younger and coming in that has maybe made a number of progressions versus somebody that is older that didn't know to ask for more and is still basing their comp on old things. And so there's a lot of different factors, but at the end of the day, it's about somebody being paid to do the same job in a fair way, and not just in that one single department, but really across the board at the organization. So if you have a group that does something for one division, and you also have another group doing something maybe not exactly the same, but very similar, are their pays wildly different as well? And so it's just looking at everything in a very cohesive way. It also factors in, is it fair to market? And this is one of the things we don't talk about very often, is it isn't just, are you underpaying everybody equally, but are you compensating your people not only with internal equity, but also external pay equity? So what you are doing is being paid fairly to market expectations for that role.
Well, that's a great segue into, the real focus of this particular show is talent acquisition. And,
Yes.
and what did your research show or indicate? What kind of data points did you come up with regard to the impact of pay equity on job seeker behavior and talent acquisition?
So the research is kind of a little bit split from I have two different pieces of research. So we did this white paper. Obviously, there's so many things historically we were taught, pay wasn't our place, right? That was a comp and benefits conversation. As a TA leader, I wasn't supposed to talk about pay, and I could bring all the data and say, hey, we can't hire anybody because everybody's making X and you only want to pay this. We were told, well, no, we've paid this big giant firm $10 million to tell us you're wrong. And everybody else that you're interviewing is wrong. And that seemed to be what was happening for a number of years. And so we have not seen talent acquisition really take ownership of pay or pay equity or pay transparency in the way that they are kind of being forced to now. Obviously, we have a lot of laws around pay transparency now. There's a lot of laws around asking somebody's salary history and it being illegal to do so in a number of places. And so recruiters are getting really thrown into something that they've had their hands slapped for talking about for the last 20 years. And the flip side of it with the pay equity piece is like, who is wanting to be underpaid, right? We know pay transparency not only impacts somebody, not pay transparency, well, pay transparency also, but pay equity does impact not just them being hired, but more so the retention of that hire after the fact. Because as long as you have humans, you're going to have humans that are going to talk about how much each other are making, whether you like it or not. And with sites like Glassdoor and Indeed and some of the other tools that are out there, more and more is the transparency around pay being exposed, which is then creating really glaring issues around pay equity at some organizations, which impacts recruiting as well as, retention. And the more we talk about all of the metrics, I mean, you go on LinkedIn and every recruiter has their bit now about these metrics suck. We could push all we want for quality of hire and retention, but there are so many factors that are not related actually to that recruiter at all. And pay equity happens to be one of them. And we can't ding a recruiter for something that is happening on a broader org if we're not allowing them to be part of the conversation.
So you talked about the different kinds of pay equity just a moment ago. So really a recruiter, if I understood what you just said, a recruiter is most focused on or deals with market equity. And then once the person has been onboarded and is in the workforce, that's when internal equity and group equity become issues. Is that correct?
Historically, what we are really pushing for and are pushing organizations into doing is making sure that recruiters have access to see pay equity standards within the organization and that these become a more public conversation. So how I said we have two different pieces of research. We also run Insights at Work every year. We ran that this year in Q1, and it surveys not just recruiting leaders and HR leaders, but we also survey executives within the organization and non-HR professionals, as well as employees and job seekers. And so we had more than 3,000 companies participate this year and job seekers participate. And the number one thing, we asked the question, what could a company provide to you to improve your experience at work? Number one thing is pay increases to keep up with new hires and pay equity. When we ask the question, when thinking about a company you want to work for, what's the most important thing to making your decision? Number one is fair compensation. And so the conversations around equity and pay and compensation in general have not really been front and center in our conversations with recruitment marketing over the last 12 or 15 years. And so more and more companies are going to start using pay equity as a market differentiator because they're going to be able to have the technology. So those internal teams are going to be able to hand this over to the recruiters and say, hey, we can show we have full pay equity within our organization. Here's the data.
Make it part of our brand.
Make it part of our brand, make it part of our story. And it probably will not be long before it's going to be required to be part of SEC filings for publicly traded organizations.
Wow, interesting. Okay, so given how important that is to talent acquisition and growing more so, as you were indicating, I was astonished. The paper you did apparently found that a lot of companies don't even know they have a pay equity problem. How does that happen? How does that happen?
Because they do this and they do this. They're like, we don't want to know. We did find most organizations don't know they have a pay equity issue. And part of that is because pay and comp has traditionally been so siloed, even between managers and teams. It has been done in a very siloed way, even when they're using technology. And we talked with some of the largest providers in the space that have ran pay equity things. Our report was sponsored by ADP. They have rolled out offerings so even the smallest employees or employers are able to start doing pay equity. So the technology historically has been very much reserved for very large organizations. It's a very labor-intensive, comprehensive process. The technology has really only emerged to look at pay equity in a fair way for organizations of all sizes within the last 24 to 36 months. It really is one of the newest areas of HR technology and work technology in general. And so that it's really exciting that it exists. But one of the biggest fears is that executives are afraid to utilize it because in some cases they don't want to know. They're afraid it's going to open them up to lawsuits. It's going to open them up to risk. It's going to open up a whole factor of other issues. On the flip side, you have a lot of HR leaders that we talk to, for some reason, specifically VP of HR level and VP of comps, that individual role very specifically, who just genuinely believe they have no issue. They would know. And so they don't want, because they feel if they found that there was an issue, it would look bad on them as a leader. So they can kind of brush this off and brush this around and then turn back around and say, well, we let the managers determine what percentages increases are or what's fair, but nobody's overseeing how this actually works.
Yeah.
It's some of the, I believe, I don't have the exact stat offhand, but the money returned back is in the billions of dollars just last year. We corrected billions of dollars of pay equity issues just in the last 12 to 18 months in the United States alone by using some of these technologies. It's a massive, massive economic impact for thousands, hundreds of thousands of families across this country.
Well, you talk about in your report that there are two kinds of initiatives that a company can undertake to make sure they don't have a problem. One is called pay equity analysis, which is more proactive and
Yep.
open to everyone because you're trying to see, where's the potential for a problem and solving it before it becomes one. And then there is the pay equity audit, which is much more legalistic, I guess, often, and therefore not as open and therefore not as helpful to management in terms of figuring out how best to solve this. Talk a little bit more about those two different kinds of activities.
Yeah, I think for most organizations, quite honestly, what most organizations are going to do is almost like a hybrid approach with using the technology today. That most companies are not going to make the large investment in bringing an auditing firm in-house to do this, purely because of cost, which has also been one of the sticking points for a long time. Why are we spending six figures trying to find out we have a problem, and then we've spent all of our budget that should have fixed the problem on the people that were coming in to tell us we have a problem? And so instead they just kind of let it go. With the new technology that we can find and actually bring in, it can look very proactively at what is happening within the organization. And so it's almost like this kind of hybrid type of approach between the two, where it can look at all of your different comp. It can use your HRS and your pay data and your performance reviews and all of these other things and look at all of these in kind of all of your buckets and silos. And it will automatically flag, hey, because sometimes it isn't actually that you have an issue company-wide. And that's something that sometimes people are like, we feel like we would know. Well, you would, but sometimes you only have an issue on one department or one manager or one location if you're a multi-site location. And so with the technology, what you can actually do is kind of have everything go in, and it's actually very simple. You don't have to be, an auditor or a comp specialist now with a lot of the new technologies. There's almost dashboards, and it will raise flags and say, hey, it seems like you might have an issue in this area. Why don't you dive in and look? And I think this is one of the biggest fears that we hear a lot is people are like, well, we don't want this automatically telling us what to do because there's always extenuating circumstances. A lot of the tech is really designed to help you just identify flags that are happening, not necessarily tell you exactly what you have to do or force you into it. And so once you do find the flags, for instance, a lot, one of the biggest gaps is around age. And so people in their 40s making less than people in their 30s because they've stayed at the same company, they've gotten a 3 to 5% raise. New hires are coming in at a 15% increase. And then your longer term employees are some of your lowest paid, even though they have the most institutional knowledge. It's so you lose and it impacts retention, which then flips over to your recruiting. You're having to pay more to hire new people versus fixing what you were paying the ones to start with in the first
Right.
place.
Right.
And so the technology really is not scary. The other thing that I think is really cool with what you can do is you can say, okay, great. I have a gap of 200. It's going to cost me $200,000 to fix my pay equity thing. Sometimes it's millions. Sometimes it isn't, right? It's going to cost me $200,000 to bring everybody into a equitable state. I only have budget for 100,000. I could put in and say, okay, I have $100,000 budget to fix this. It will tell me who is the most far off and who's going to be the highest risk of retention to go through and need to get corrected and fixed. And so it doesn't have to be this big, scary audit. People get really freaked out by that word. This doesn't have to be that big of a deal anymore in order to have a really major effect. And for comp teams, one of the things when we're talking to them, what we talk about is how they can rely more with the TA teams. I'm also working heavily with a number of the TAtech vendors to figure out a way that we can actually get market data around what they are actually hearing in the market, what people are asking for, if it is outside of the range, so that they can report this in a way that isn't necessarily tied to that employee, but more tied to the job. So this can get shared back with the comp and benefits team internally, so that real-time market data is coming through. There's also a number of external labor market products that are coming on the market that are actually looking at all of the pay transparency job postings and pulling together what these average salaries are and giving much more real-time information than what we were seeing with some of the traditional comp and benefit audit programs.
You know, as I listen to you speak, it seems to me that compensation and benefits has always been a big role in HR for obvious reasons. I used to be a partner in the Hay Group, which had a methodology out of the 1950s and a very effective one for many, many years. I think the big challenge, I mean, obviously it's easy to understand. You might not like it, and you might not agree with it, but at least it's easy to understand the market equity piece. But internal equity, in the sense that you're not keeping up with what's happening in the market. Inflation just exacerbates that problem. You've got your all-stars, and they're falling farther and farther behind the market. And oh, by the way, their dollar, what you are paying them, buys less because of inflation. So pay is going to be a huge issue. And of course, we all know the relationship between retention and talent acquisition. For every person that goes out the door, that recruiter's got to fill that job.
And the cost goes up, right? That's one of the craziest things. The conversations between retention and recruiting have been so siloed for so many years. We seem to have lost any common sense around the reality that every time we lose an employee, it costs more to replace them. I'm not talking about all of the it's 25% of an employee, none of that stuff, right? Like, great. Okay. The actual cost of hire, their salary, their benefits, all of that are typically a very significant increase over what you were paying the person before, not to mention a 6 to 12 month on-ramp time to get them up to speed where the other person already was. And so it's a massive, massive cost to the business outside of the actual cost to hire a new person. And yet we haven't done a really great job. TA has not advocated for this in really, I think, the right way inside most organizations. There's a few TA leaders that do a really phenomenal job at this, but overall, I think it's not something that we talk about very successfully at most of the recruiting conferences, at most of the recruiting events. And it's something that a number of us have been pushing for over 15 years to get talked about more. Um, and I just don't understand why we aren't heavily focused on how do we really combine talent management and talent acquisition versus trying to keep them as a silo and being so competitive with each other.
Yeah, and then, too many organizations beat their chests in pride, when they announce that they're going to do a 4% pay raise, average pay raise, when inflation is double that. So,
Correct. Yes.
it's hard to it's hard to accept the fact that we have been careful about pay historically, and I'm delighted to hear about this technology. So if people want to know more about what you've learned in that particular report, or just more about what Aspect 43 does and so forth, how can they be in touch with you?
They can go to aspect43.com and download the report. There's also one on pay transparency, which is taken more from a legal and compliance perspective. Our senior analyst and lead analyst is actually a employment law attorney. And so she has left and works with us now. And so she's very solid on compliance and employer law. And so we're always looking at all of these things, not just from the, like in theory, how would this actually work? But like in practicality, what do we actually do to make sure that our companies are not being sued? Number one. Number two, what do we need to do in order to make sure that what we are doing is helping us hire and retain the right level of talent? And number three, how do we do what we need to do and go above and beyond the bare minimum? And I think a lot of times, one of my challenges with a lot of the content that is produced out there is that it goes directly to this, like, here's the most amazing side of it. And this theoretical, where most companies are trying to get, quite honestly, to a bare minimum level at this point. And that's okay. Like, we don't have to go from step A to step Z, but we need to make sure that we are being legally compliant, that we're doing some of these really basic things. Pay transparency is a really great starting point. I know there's a lot of pushback in the recruiter community about this. It really is a very positive thing. It is not a positive thing if you don't have a really solid partnership with your comp and benefits team. And if I could give any advice to recruiters out there, it is to befriend these people and get to know them. Build the trust, build the relationships, not just give me the data, tell me what this is, but ask how they're getting it. Understand what they are doing. Actually show a little bit of interest, and then and you're able to properly represent your business in a completely different way. But I think you're spot on. Like I said, our Insights at Work research will publish next week, so they can get a copy of that. Also, they could pre-register on the site for that. But every single buyer behavior, every single buyer trend that we found is all related to compensation and pay. And recruiting has dropped for businesses second to retention for the first time in 12 years. And pay has moved to the number one issue in 7 out of the 9 questions. The only thing rated higher is stress.
Well, there you have it.
Once.
There you have it. And I would argue that if you aren't paid enough, your stress is going to go
Your
up.
stress, yes.
Well, listen, Sarah, this has been great. I've certainly learned a lot, and I suspect our listeners have as well. So thank you very much for being here. And to all of you, please, you can see this particular show again on our site. We've recorded it. So please do stop by and watch it again. Please tell your friends about it. And come on back next time for the next episode of Recruit Savvy from TAtech. Thanks again. Bye-bye now.
Thanks so much.